Hi everyone, and welcome to week 6 on self-determination and decolonization during the Cold War. As usual, here are the learning objectives. Reading 1 is by our familiar friend Sam Moyne, whose thesis, you may recall, is that human rights didn't break through until the 1970s. In this chapter, he argues that anti-colonialism wasn't a human rights movement. Decolonization was primarily about securing sovereignty for national independence movements, rather than securing individual protection against the state. Whatever you make of this argument, focus particularly on the first few sections of the chapter, which provide some helpful pre-1945 background that explains why some colonized peoples may have been skeptical of individual rights as potential instruments of domination more than liberation. Also, the key point here is that when the UN was founded in 1945, self-determination and human rights were considered separately. That was about to change. Reading 2 is by Australian historian Roland Burke, whose book documents the revolutionary influence of decolonization on the human rights agenda. There were only 51 member states when the UN was founded in 1945. By 1960, this nearly doubled, with new countries from the Third World. This growth in UN membership influenced a shift in human rights rhetoric during the 1950s and 60s. So whereas the right to self-determination was notably absent from the 1948 Universal Declaration, it became the centerpiece in a common Article 1 of the two international covenants on human rights that were adopted in 1966. And Chapter 2 takes a closer look at the competing currents within anti-colonialism, marked by the pursuit of national determination on the one hand and the advancement of universal human rights on the other. This tension reflects the paradox of human rights and states. Moreover, this reading returns to our Hannah Arendt theme this course, on the right to have rights. The argument here is that human rights depend upon self-determination. In other words, self-determination comes first, then human rights. We'll see this again later on. Reading 3 is another selection from historian Paul Lauren. This reading is mostly for background context. Don't feel compelled with this one. Anyways, the first section of the chapter outlines the advancement of international human rights law following the Universal Declaration, not just at the level of global governance, but also at the domestic level of politics as well. The second section examines the machinery of the human rights regime, in which the Economic and Social Council of the UN was an important component in setting the agenda. The third section looks at the expansion of human rights as a social movement, covering similar terrain with Moyne and others. And the final section brings us up to the end of the 20th century, which we'll cover in the following weeks. I highly recommend reading 4 by Indigenous scholar Derek Nault, citizen of the Red River Métis Nation. This is from a book about how Africa and other countries from the global south have shaped our contemporary international human rights system. This chapter in particular assesses Africa's contribution to so-called third-generation rights, solidarity or group rights that emerged in tandem after World War II. It traces the genealogy of 3 such human rights incorporated into the UN's mandate from the 1950s to the 80s. The right to self-determination, the right to racial non-discrimination, and the right to development. The whole chapter is worth a read, but I'm especially interested in the third section, on the right to development, which was finally recognized by the UN in 1986 despite Western opposition. I want you to especially consider how the meaning of development began as a Eurocentric program of modern economic planning and evolved into a much broader concept as a result of decolonization. Reading 5 is by Danish legal scholar Stephen Jensen, who argues that the human rights breakthrough wasn't in the 1940s or 70s, but during the 1960s, at the height of decolonization, described as the largest transfer of sovereign power in the history of humankind. And it's surprising that the 1960s has remained almost a forgotten decade in human rights historiography, especially given the fact that the 2 international covenants were adopted by the UN in 1966. This reading is an introductory chapter that is mostly historiographical in nature, so I'd put this one further down my recommendation list. Anyways, here's the general takeaway from this reading. So, if human rights were considered separately from self-determination when the UN was founded immediately after World War II, they became conjoined as a result of decolonization. To revisit the argument from reading 2, self-determination has become a precondition for human rights. Finally, reading 6 is at the bottom of my recommendation list, as this reading is mostly technical. It is, however, a classic reference in the jurisprudential literature on self-determination and international law. This is a big PDF file, 118 pages. Don't read this, just skim it. Look at how the chapters are organized in Part 1. It starts with sovereignty and statehood, reflecting the primacy of the state in international law. Then comes self-determination, which is, as far as international law is concerned, a means to an end. Self-determination, in the most assertive sense of the term, means obtaining political independence, getting sovereignty. Everything that follows is secondary, so look at how the subsequent chapters are organized. Minority rights, indigenous rights, and only finally, at the end, human rights. Again, sovereignty comes first, then human rights. We're yet again revisiting the tension that follows from the paradox of human rights and states. Okay, so that's it. You should be making progress on your final paper. Reach out to me with any questions. I'm happy to look at drafts in any shape whatsoever, good or bad. In the meantime, let's pick up on the discussion forum. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you